So we may have this set of expectations that we make into reasons to struggle against some or even most of reality. We place ourselves in opposition to reality as a whole and cling to a few expectations or many expectations or just one expectation. Oh, you know the one I mean. It was her, it was that woman, or it was that enemy country, or it was whatever very, very important and passionate expectation there may be. That's the one that we struggle against. We may struggle against reality to impose on reality. Our totalitarian, tyrant, fascist orientation of our arrogant orientation of clinging to a certain set of expectations and then imposing those expectations on all of the rest of reality, on all people, on our own future. That mode of suffering, of agonizing, of struggling to keep things perfect, to make them ideal. That idealism is suffering, anxiety, frustration, even confusion, the lack of clarity about the expectations merely being expectations, that produces confusion. If one realizes, again, if one realizes, I had some expectations and then something happened, and some of my expectations might be how things went, and some of them might not, and basically the expectations as expectations are no longer important once I know what reality is. I don't really pay a lot of attention or give a lot of attention to the old expectations that I had. Well, those were the expectations I had, but check out reality. Let's make some new expectations. Fine. Expectations themselves aren't problematic. In and of themselves, expectations don't inevitably produce suffering or frustration or confusion. When the expectations are recognized as expectations, then they're just guidelines for what we may look for in the future, because we're expecting, oh, it's a green traffic light all of a sudden, so we expect the vehicles in front of us to begin to move through the intersection. But if they don't, we simply notice that they're not moving, or one of them isn't moving. It's not confusing once we notice that one of the vehicles isn't moving. We might honk our horn. We may think, oh, maybe the person's texting or whatever it may be. We may have a very practical, direct response. Okay, there's a car that's not moving. I'll honk. Okay? And then you go from there. There's no inherent confusion or frustration. Now, if I'm expecting to be to a certain place on time and this vehicle not moving seems to me to be a barrier, an enemy, and all those kind of things, well, that has to do with this background of distress and this background of my expectation about myself. And we'll get back to the subject of expectations about oneself and perceptions about oneself, and controlling all of that can take a lot of energy. But for the moment, again, we see a red traffic light, we expect it to turn green. And it does. It turns green. Or maybe it doesn't, but let's say that it does turn green. And then we expect the vehicles to begin to move forward through the intersection. And we know these are just expectations. These aren't arrogant ideals. Or they don't have to be. They might be. But let's say that we don't have any arrogance and we don't have this background of distress. So we just notice the lights turn green, the vehicles aren't moving, and we might honk. Or we might, if there's enough lanes, we might go around. If there's enough room, we might go around that car. We might look closely and see, is the car not working? Does the person have a medical issue like a heart attack, and there's someone in the car but they look like they're not able to drive? So there's a variety of ways that we might perceive, but we will be looking at reality in our midst, bringing new perceptions rather than looking away from reality as it is and focusing on our expectations and our conversation about, oh, this means I'm going to be late, and I can't believe that this happened to me just a week ago, and oh, I saw that video about the guy talking about it, and I hate it when this happens, and the world's really out to get me, and whatever set of expectations I might have about it as an internal conversation that I'm talking to myself on my little internal monologue dialogue, I can get out of that and back to, okay, there's a green light, there's a vehicle, it's not moving, is the vehicle blocking me? Whatever, right? Just taking action. There's actions to take. There's new perceptions to reach out to. There's new explorations to pursue, to proceed with, to find out, to become clear what's going on with that car, with that driver. How can I assist? How can I support the outcome of that car getting through the intersection so this car that I'm in can get through the intersection? Because that's what I'm interested in. So that doesn't require arrogance, doesn't require idealism. I can have an ideal or an idea without it being idealistically and arrogantly and naively clung to. I can just say, okay, my ideal is to be at that intersection now, or that intersection within 20 seconds. I want to have my car in that intersection. That's my ideal. Okay, great. Or that's my expectation. That I expect that I'm going to be able to be there within 20 seconds. Okay, fine. What actions? Is there a state of eternal fear and anger and grieving? And if there is, then that's what there is to do, is to experience the fear and the anger and the grieving. There's not going to be looking for new perceptions at that moment until one notices the anger as anger or the fear as fear. Once those things are noticed, they can be set aside. Or one can bring one's attention away from the my internal dialogue about what should be and how it should be and who I am and how my life's supposed to be and should be, and how this reminds me of that, my parents and how they should have been, and this in 2004, that one thing, how it reminds me of all these things. So rather than go into all that, I can say, okay, there's fear and there's tension and there's anger, and I don't have to do anything about it. I don't have to figure it out. I can actually set it aside or bring my attention to getting through the intersection. Look at okay, there's the traffic light. There's the vehicle in front of me. Just take some kind of action that produces some favorable results. And later, perhaps, I might explore that fear, that anger, those expectations that I might not have known were expectations. What was I expecting in 2004? That was different from what I got. Not what did I get? It's not to actually look at what did I get in 2004, what did I experience, but what were the expectations that I had prior to that? A lot of times when people are doing something like psychotherapy or whatever, they keep looking at what actually happened, what actually happened, what actually happened. Well, what actually happened in and of itself might be there was a traffic light, it turned red or it turned green, and then the car didn't move. That's not in controversy. That's not the issue. That's not important necessarily. What were the expectations? What were the reactions? That could be interesting. However, to simply be with the reactions, to be with the fearing, to be with the anxiety, to be with the struggling, and notice the struggling, and to stop struggling, to recognize struggling as a behavior, and I can struggle against struggling, which perpetuates struggling, or I can notice the struggling and just keep noticing. Notice something else. That means I'm not struggling anymore. It's not that I actually go out and stop struggling. I might do something that interrupts or disrupts the pattern of struggling, but I might not. I might just notice the struggling and then notice something else. So, we may make some of reality, or even most of reality, into a problem, and then try to fix our own problem with reality, so that the unexpected, embarrassing details of reality may eventually conform with our sacred idolatries of expectations, or at least appear to conform to our sacred idolatries of expectations. Also, we may be very interested in other people's perceptions, other people's misperceptions or lack of perceptions. We may attempt to manipulate and control their perceptions without acknowledging it, without knowing it ourselves. We may be attempting to manipulate and control other people without even being aware of it. It's not necessarily realistic to think I'm never going to influence anyone else again. Of course, my interactions could influence other people, and I could actually think, here's the outcome I want, and then I take some action that conforms to producing that outcome, or that I imagine may conform to producing that outcome. But what if I don't acknowledge my own interests, my own priorities, my own intended outcomes? And yet I'm still trying to influence others. I'm still influencing others. We may be very interested in other people's perceptions, misperceptions, or lack of perception, especially about us or about myself. We may be very interested in other people's presumptions and expectations. What do they presume? What do they expect? We manage their expectations. We resist certain expectations and presumptions and perceptions. Perhaps we encourage certain perceptions and presumptions and expectations. And that can take a fair amount of energy, especially if one doesn't recognize that that's what one is doing. Again, to influence other people's experience, perceptions, presumptions, that's inevitable. If I speak to someone, I'm influencing their perception. I say, hey, look, the light's green. What was the idea of that? That they're going to look and see, oh, there's a green traffic light. Obviously, I'm influencing their perception. I'm trying to influence their behavior, so if they're the driver, then they are prepared or go ahead and begin to accelerate and move the vehicle forward. We are interested in other people's perceptions. But being interested doesn't require suffering or struggling or frustration. We may be interested in other people's actions. Why? Because their actions may affect the results that we experience. Their actions may affect our experience. Other people may affect our experience. And we may resist that. We may resist admitting that and resist recognizing that. Maybe in order to conform with some ideal of invulnerability and power and independence, and those people don't have any influence over me. No, they. I am not going to look at that traffic light because of what happened in 2004 with this person or the person they remind me of or whatever. Right? It's just a strange story of drama, and we could say suffering. And it is how human life sometimes goes. So we may be very interested in other people, their actions, their perceptions, and how they influence our experience. And we may admit it. We may admit that we're interested in our experience and that other people are part of our experience. And we may admit that we are interested in how they influence us and how we influence them, and what we as a group of people experience. Not just what I experience, not just what that person experiences, but even a larger group. We may want other people, maybe certain other people or all other people in general, to have the same expectations that we do. It's much simpler that way. It's convenient. It's not threatening or disruptive to us having those expectations. Okay, so we might be interested in other people having the same expectations we do or similar expectations. We might be interested in finding out what other people's expectations are that do not match ours. But we may want to control other people's perceptions and expectations and find out what are their expectations. And if their expectations do not match ours, then we may want to change theirs, to manipulate theirs, to influence theirs. And again, we may admit that we do want to influence other people's expectations. Why wouldn't we be interested in their expectations? We may be interested in their presumptions. We may want them to have the same presumptions that we do. We may be interested in their perceptions, their experience. We may want them to have the same experiences that we do. If we're frustrated, we may want them to be frustrated too. If we're sad or disappointed, we may want them to be sad or disappointed. If we are grateful, we may want them to be grateful. If we're courageous, we may want them to be courageous, or at least have the opportunity to experience gratitude and courage. Or we may fear the unfamiliar. More precisely, we may fear a repetition of a past experience where someone else's perception and our perception did not match, and then maybe there was an argument or an altercation. Remember in 2004, you remember the one? And we may be resisting a recurrence of something that was frightening for us or that was sad for us or infuriating or shameful. So we may fear a repeating of the experience of ignorance. So when I say we may fear the unfamiliar, we're actually fearing a repeat of an old experience of learning, of disagreement, or a lack of agreement. We may fear reality, or we may fear some of reality. We may fear a lot of reality. Or we may focus a lot on some aspect of reality that we fear. That paranoia. That could be called caution. We may worship our expectations or ideals. We may reject and condemn some of reality or even most of it. We may ridicule others who dare to suggest that reality may not precisely conform with whatever idealistic expectations we worship. We may even attack them with antagonism, as distinct from attacking them without antagonism. We may reactively attack them rather than surgically attacking them or or strategically attacking them. Our attacks may be verbal, they may be military, whatever it may be. As the ancient Hebrew scripture in Ecclesiastes says, there's a time for peace and a time for war. And certainly thousands of years prior to those scriptures being written down, people were talking and made reference to the fact that there is such a thing as war, and there is such a thing as peace. Ancient Vedic Indian scriptures refer to peace and war. Ancient Chinese scriptures refer to peace and war. Peace and war, or conflict and cooperation, or activity and stillness. These contrasting possibilities are both possible. And a hunter or a fisherman may cause injury or cause death. A warrior or soldier may cause injury and cause death without antagonism. However, there may be antagonism. So we're talking not about violence so much as, when somebody cuts a tree down, we could say that's quite violent. They're killing the tree. But there's not typically antagonism toward the tree. So violence is distinct from antagonism. So we're talking about angst, anxiety, antagonism, anger, or contempt in particular, as well as serenity, peace, like inner peace. Even if there's cutting down a tree or firing a missile or firing a cannon or sending troops out to have the cavalry storm whatever, sent the hunting party out to go and slaughter the deer or the elk. There can be an inner peace. There can be an inner serenity. So we may not admit that our expectations are just that, are just expectations. We may call them how things really should be, or how life is supposed to be, rather than how I have been trained to suppose or presume or expect that life might be, perhaps. We may engage in antagonistic debates and withdraw in resentment that someone did not agree with our exact set of expectations. We may split our religious traditions and our political parties into smaller and smaller sects and smaller partisan interest groups that are competing and conflicting. Of course, we can, without antagonism and without struggling and contempt for other humans, we can form small groups to promote a particular set of perceptions, a particular set of outcomes, and so on. But that does not require the angst and antagonism and contempt and resentment that is so typical of splintering groups of true believers. You have the Christians and then the Catholics and Protestants, and then there's the Jesuits and the Franciscans and the Catholic group, and then the Baptists and the Methodists. And everybody's fighting against each other, and then you have the Mormons, and then they have the Reformed Mormons, and then you have the Jews, and then you have the Orthodox Jews versus the Reformed Jews, and splitting into smaller and smaller groups. And you have the Republican Party, and then you have the Tea Party coalition within the Republican Party, and then you have the Christian fundamentalist coalition of the Republican Party, and then the Tea Party. You have they split up into smaller groups, and it's smaller and smaller, and everybody's looking for who are the people that have the right perspective, like I do. And you have all these groups who are bringing potentially a rather arrogant idealism, whether they're Catholics or Jesuits or Republicans or whatever it may be, Dixiecrats, Democrats, and so on. There can be this divisiveness. There can also be a perception of a vast array of perspectives and no divisiveness. I agree with these people on 20% of those issues, and I disagree with them on 60%, and we're neutral, or kind of they just don't care about those other 20%. And this group of people, we agree on 80% of the issues, but we disagree on 20%. And you just have this sense of clarity about, okay, I have my preferences, they have their preferences, or they have their focus, their priority, and they overlap where they overlap, they conflict where they conflict, and that's it. There's no inherent antagonism or divisiveness in noticing the distinctions between different groups and different perspectives and different interests. Of course, the pharmaceutical industry has different interests than the oil industry. And of course, they have some common interests. And of course, there could be some conflict between the interests of these different industries and partisan sectarian groups. True believers tend, is a term I use in quotations, typically idealistic, arrogant belief rather than faith. Faith, I address in other places more what I mean by faith, but faith basically is a recognition of what I say I will focus on. There's not that baseline of distress or trying to manage other people's perceptions so that I look glorious and perfect. If other people say, hey, we only agree with you 80%, I say, that's right, we agree on about 80%. And I don't have any divisiveness or belligerence to the fact that there may be some people that I don't entirely, we only agree on 98%. And so some people might focus on the 2% they don't agree on. Other people might disagree on 90% of things and still focus on the 10% that they agree on. Other people in a conversation, a group of people, there could be a huge set of cultural differences and a huge set of differences between people. And some people are open and interested in the differences between varying perspectives. Elderly people and children. Of course, they're going to have some different perspectives and different interests. Pharmaceutical companies and the oil industry, of course, they're going to have some different perspectives. Those aren't conflicting. They're distinct. They may be, and they may be conflicting as well. But they're, in addition to the possibility of conflict, there may simply be distinction or variation between expectations, perceptions, priorities, interests, practices, and behaviors, and so on. So we may have a lot of concern about how other people perceive us. I may have a lot of concern about how other people perceive me. I may adopt a persona that is a set of qualities which I wish to display to others. We could even say a set of pretenses, perceptions. I want them to have, whatever the reality is, I want them to have certain perceptions that are designed to conform to what I expect people to expect of me. So they will like me. I'm concerned with them liking me. And this, again, is functional for me to be attentive to how other people perceive me. Or it can be important. Or it can seem important. Or it can be what people actually do. That they're attentive to how other people perceive them. That I'm attentive to how other people perceive me. That I'm concerned about finding out what they expect and what they like. And then producing perceptions on their part that conform with what they expect and what they value. As a salesperson or as a politician, it is important to know what people value. If you're talking to somebody about buying a house and they say, you know what, I'd really like a house with a fenced backyard. That would be good to recognize and to show them mostly houses that have fenced backyards, because that's what they've said their value. So if they say, I like people who have these 3 traits, and I don't like people who have these 2 traits, well, then I might emphasize to them what I have in common with them. It's just functional to emphasize some of what may be in common. Oh, I'm interested in language, and you're interested in language too? Cool, let's talk about language a little bit. So, or I'm interested in psychology. You are too? Great, let's talk about that. And there may be 20 things that we don't have as common interests. So, the points of common interest are where conversations are most likely to happen. If there's a spirit of openness, if there's a spirit of divisiveness, the fact that there may be common interests is irrelevant. I don't, if somebody's from my same hometown, but that's irrelevant, and we're just trying to get through the intersection of the traffic light. I don't really want to talk about, oh, this is the high school I went to, and yeah, I think I know your sister, and we don't need to get into that. Or we can get into that after we get through the traffic, the intersection. So we may adopt a persona that is a set of pretenses designed to conform to what we expect people to expect of us, of all our ideals and idolatries. How I really am and how I am not may be the most intense and most cherished idealism or idolatry or preoccupation. Source of potential frustration. We may create scapegoats and enemies whom we accuse of being how no one should be. How we probably also claim not to be, of course, because no one should be that way, so we would assert and present that we're not that way. Now we may know that we have some of those qualities, or that we're capable of having some of those qualities, but we may strive not to display them, not to let them come out, to restrain them, to renounce them, to suppress them, to repress them. We may say, okay, here's how people should not be. And we may know that we have some of those qualities, but we may claim not to have those qualities, or we may emphasize other qualities in a struggle to manage other people's perceptions of us. Or maybe not a struggle, maybe in a process of influencing other people's perceptions of us. Maybe there's clarity that there's an interest in other people's perceptions. Or sometimes there is, and sometimes there isn't. Interests arise and subside and move and shift. So in saying, here's how no one should be and here's how everyone should be, part of that how no one should be could come out like this. Look at those evil people. No one should be like that. And do not look at me. No, look over there. Look over there. Look up the stop. Don't look at me. Hey, look at those evil people. Don't look at me. We may resist waking up. We may resist coming to consciousness. We may resist perceiving reality or some aspect of reality. We may resist some aspect of reality. We may resist some experience. We may resist some perception. We may resist courage in favor of fear and frustration and struggling and suffering and agonizing. And to practice agonizing and get really good at it, we come to recognize our tremendous responsibility and our tremendous capacity. We can practice agonizing and then experience agonizing. If we can practice agonizing and then experience agonizing, then we can actually also practice things like responsibility and experience responsibility. We can practice creativity and experience creativity. We can practice gratitude and experience gratitude. So, recognizing that we can practice agonizing or practice frustration or practice confusion could be actually a very functional and valuable learning process. We could be grateful that we have experienced confusion and frustration and anxiety so as to cultivate our attention to our own practices, to our own tendencies and capacities. We may have resisted courage in favor of fear and frustration, and recognizing that we have been resisting courage can be what happens right before we start to explore courage, with some curiosity, with some caution maybe, but with courage, even gratitude. We may fiercely deny resisting courage. We may fiercely deny that we've been practicing and cultivating fear and paranoia and anxiety and hysteria, frustration, suffering, agonizing. We may deny that those are the practices that we have been investing in or enacting. Have we been pretending to be what we're not in order to promote certain perceptions of us? Perhaps we've been promoting certain perceptions of us, including pretending to be what we're not. In other words, acting. Or experimenting, practicing. If I don't feel courageous, I can practice being courageous. And I might not be very good at it, and I might not be very courageous, but I start to do some of the things and take the small steps. And we can call that pretending to be courageous, or we could call that being just a little bit courageous, right? Because pretending to be courageous involves a certain amount of courage, doesn't it? So this idea that people shouldn't pretend, or children should not pretend, or adults should not pretend, well, that's just one possible expectation. That's one possible presumption. Maybe we've been trained not to pretend. Maybe we've been trained not to admit that we may be pretending. When I'm joking around with somebody, pretending, especially, well, I was going to say especially when it's obvious that I'm pretending, that can be really funny and ironic and interesting, surprising, entertaining, amusing. Or what about when I tell someone a joke and it is not clear to them that I am joking, and they think I'm being very serious, and I'm pretending to be serious or displaying seriousness, when in fact in the background there's tremendous irony and humor. But the display, maybe belligerence or boredom or something that is not a fit with the actual playing or pretending that is in the background. So I called this expectations, frustrations, and relief. But I didn't talk about relief much, did I? Well, consider that clarity about expectations as just being expectations, and frustrations as just being frustrations, and agonizing as just being the practice of agonizing. That kind of clarity allows for release, relief, inner peace, serenity. Gratitude, anything. Humor, joy. Relaxation. And a functional way of relating to expectations as being merely expectations. Other people will have expectations sometimes. Other people will have frustrations sometimes. I may have frustrations sometimes. Okay. I don't have to expect to never be frustrated. I might expect that, but I don't have to. I might expect that other people will never be frustrated, but I don't have to. It could be that I'm committed to people experiencing serenity and relief and responsibility and freedom. And so, if those are priorities, I can take actions that conform with sustaining and cultivating those experiences.